The Mingo Oak stood at the head of a hollow in Logan County, West Virginia, its trunk so wide that 6 men could not encircle it with their arms linked. In 1938, when it finally fell, not to a lumberjack's axe, but to the slow, inexorable decay of age, the tree had been alive for more than 6 centuries. It had witnessed the passage of Shawnee hunting parties, the arrival of white settlers, the smoke of the Civil War drifting over the mountain ridges, and the rise of the coal camps that transformed the Tug Fork Valley into a patchwork of company towns and slag heaps. But in the winter of 1880, the Mingo Oak witnessed something else. Something that no one spoke of afterward. Something that the tree carried to its grave 6 decades later. The tree itself was a landmark, so ancient that it appeared on no surveyor's map, because no surveyor had thought to measure a thing so permanent. Its branches spread like the arms of a cathedral, and its roots plunged deep into the hillside, where veins of bituminous coal ran black and rich beneath the soil. The Mingo Oak was a meeting place, a boundary marker, a silent witness to the lives of the people who lived in its shadow. And on a cold November morning in 1880, it became the final resting place of a secret that would not stay buried. The first person to notice something was wrong was a 12-year-old boy named Enoch Toler, who had been sent by his mother to collect firewood from the hollow below the oak. The Toler family lived in a cabin not far from the tree, one of a scattering of homesteads that clung to the steep hillsides like barnacles to the hull of a sinking ship. Enoch's father had been a coal miner before the mine collapsed on him in '76, and after that Enoch's mother took in washing and mending to keep the family alive. The boy knew the hollow as well as he knew his own hands. He knew where the blackberries ripened in August, where the ginseng grew beneath the beech trees, and where the spring water ran sweet and cold even in the driest summers. But on that November morning, he found something he had never seen before. It was a man's boot, half buried in the leaf litter at the base of the oak. The boot was not old. The leather was still supple, the stitching still intact. Enoch knelt down and brushed away the leaves, and beneath the boot, he found a man's leg, still attached to the boot, but the rest of the body was nowhere to be seen. The leg had been severed cleanly at the knee, and the wound was clean, as if it had been cut with a sharp blade. Not torn. Not chewed by animals. Cut. Enoch Toler ran back to the cabin, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and told his mother what he had found. She sent him to fetch his uncle, a man named Silas Toler who lived 2 miles up the hollow and who had served as a deputy sheriff in Logan County during the years after the war. Silas was a tall, gaunt man with a graying beard and eyes that had seen too much violence to be surprised by much of anything. But when he saw the boot and the leg beneath the Mingo Oak, his face went pale, and he sent Enoch back to the cabin to stay with his mother while he rode into Logan to fetch the sheriff. The sheriff was a man named Harrison Dinges, a former Union soldier who had settled in the county after the war and had been elected to the position on a platform of order and stability. Logan County in 1880 was a place of contradictions. The coal boom that would transform the region was still a decade away, but the timber industry was already in full swing, and the railroads were pushing their way into the hollows, bringing with them money, whiskey, and violence. The county had a population of just over 5,000 people, scattered across the steep hills and narrow valleys, and the sheriff's office was underfunded, understaffed, and often overmatched. Sheriff Dinges took the report from Silas Toler and rode out to the Mingo Oak with a posse of 4 men. What they found beneath the oak stopped them cold. The leg was exactly as Enoch had described it, a clean cut above the knee, the boot still in good condition. The sheriff ordered his men to dig around the base of the tree, and within an hour, they had uncovered more, a torso, severed at the waist, the arms also missing, the head nowhere to be found. The body had been dismembered with surgical precision, the cuts made at the joints, the bones sawed cleanly through. The man's clothing, what remained of it, was of good quality, a woolen shirt, a canvas vest, and the single boot, which suggested that he had been wearing fine leather boots at the time of his death. He had been a big man, broad-shouldered, likely in his 30s or 40s. But there was nothing to identify him. No wallet. No watch. No ring. No papers. Just the mutilated remains of a man who had been carefully, methodically, and almost ritually dismembered. The sheriff and his men searched the hollow and the hillside above the oak, but they found no more remains. The head, the arms, and the other boot were simply gone. Whoever had killed this man had taken those parts away, leaving only the torso and the single leg to be discovered by the boy gathering firewood. It was as if the killer wanted the body to be found, or, perhaps more chillingly, did not care whether it was found or not. Sheriff Dingus had the remains wrapped in canvas and transported to the county seat, where he summoned the only doctor in the area, a man named Dr. Enoch Browning. Dr. Browning was a graduate of the University of Virginia's medical school, a rare distinction in a county where most people had never seen a physician with formal training. He examined the remains in his surgery, and what he found only deepened the mystery. The dismemberment had been done with a sharp instrument, a surgical saw, or perhaps a meat cleaver wielded with extraordinary precision. The cuts were made at the joints, not through the bones, suggesting that the killer knew anatomy. The body had been drained of blood, which suggested that the dismemberment had occurred shortly after death, while the heart was still pumping, or that the killer had hanged the body and allowed the blood to drain out. The doctor estimated that the man had been dead for no more than 2 or 3 days. But the most disturbing detail, the detail that would haunt Sheriff Dingus for the rest of his life, was this: the cuts were too clean. They were not the work of a butcher or a hunter. They were the work of someone who had done this before. Someone who knew exactly where to cut. The first question, of course, was who the dead man was. Sheriff Dingus made inquiries up and down the Tug Fork Valley, from the mouth of the hollow to the railroad camp at Chapmanville. He sent word to the neighboring counties of Mingo, Boone, and Kanawha. He questioned the railroad men, the timber cutters, the miners who had begun to trickle into the region, and the farmers who had been there for generations. But no one came forward to identify the body. No one reported a missing man. It was as if the man beneath the Mingo Oak had never existed. And yet, the people of Logan County knew that someone was missing. There was a strange unease in the air, a sense that something was wrong in the hollows, something that no one wanted to talk about. The Mingo Oak had always been a place of gathering, a place where men met to trade, to talk, to settle disputes. But after the discovery, people began to avoid the hollow. The children were warned not to play near the old tree. The women walked faster when they passed the base of the hill. The tree itself seemed to loom larger, darker, more menacing. Sheriff Dingus did not believe in ghosts or omens. He believed in evidence. But the evidence in this case was maddeningly thin. The remains had told him almost nothing. The torso had no scars, no tattoos, no distinguishing marks. The single boot was of a common make, sold in stores throughout the region. The canvas vest was unmarked. The woolen shirt was of a type worn by dozens of men in the county. The sheriff did the only thing he could do. He sent a description of the body to the major newspapers in Charleston and Wheeling, along with a request for any information about missing men. He also wrote to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the private detective firm that had become famous for its work in tracking down outlaws and solving crimes throughout the country. The Pinkertons had a reputation for getting results, and Sheriff Dingus hoped that their resources, their network of informants, their archives of fugitives, their ability to cross state lines without regard for local jurisdiction, might yield something. The reply from the Pinkertons arrived 3 weeks later. It was polite, professional, and utterly useless. The agency had no record of any missing man matching the description. They offered to send a detective to Logan County for a consultation fee of $50 a day plus expenses, a sum that the sheriff's office could not possibly afford. Sheriff Dingus would have to solve this mystery on his own. But he would not solve it. He would die a decade later, his office passed to a younger man, and the mystery of the man beneath the Mingo Oak would remain unsolved. The torso and the leg would be buried in the county cemetery, in an unmarked grave, the identity of the man they belonged to as unknown in death as it had been in life. The sheriff was not the only one who was disturbed by the discovery. There were others, people who had seen things, heard things, suspected things, but who dared not speak. One of them was a woman named Henrietta McCoy, who lived in a cabin 2 ridges over from the Mingo Oak. She was a midwife and a healer, known throughout the Hollows for her knowledge of herbs and her ability to ease the pain of childbirth and the misery of dying. She was also a woman with a past that had brought her to Logan County in the years after the war, fleeing a different kind of violence, a different kind of loss. Henrietta McCoy was not her real name. She had taken it years ago, after the war, when the old name had become a danger to her. Her real name was Henrietta Ponder, and she had been a slave before the war. She had been born in Virginia, on a plantation in the Shenandoah Valley, and she had escaped to the north in 1863, following the Union Army as it marched south through Tennessee and into Georgia. She had been a cook, a nurse, a laundress, and sometimes, when the need was great, a spy. She knew how to read, which was rare enough for a woman of her station. She could also write, which was rarer still. After the war, she had wandered west, drifting through the mountains of Kentucky and the hills of West Virginia, living on the margins of a society that did not quite know how to accommodate a free black woman with no family and no protector. She had settled in Logan County because it was remote, because people minded their own business, and because the mineral springs in the hollows reminded her of the springs back home in Virginia. She had become a midwife because she had experience, and because the women in the county needed someone who understood the terrors of childbirth. Henrietta had known that something was wrong beneath the Mingo Oak long before Enoch Toler found the boot. The tree had been speaking to her, in the way that ancient things sometimes speak to those who are willing to listen. There was a feeling of malevolence around the tree, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. And then there were the sounds. The sounds that carried on the night wind, the sounds of sawing, of cutting, of something being dragged through the leaves. She had not gone to the sheriff because she knew that no one would believe her. She was a woman, and a black woman at that, and her testimony would be worth nothing. But she had her own suspicions, her own theories, her own reasons for being afraid. The months passed, and the mystery receded from the front pages of the newspapers. The story of the man beneath the Mingo Oak became a footnote, a brief sensation that was quickly overshadowed by the usual stories of the day: the election of a new president, the construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, the troubles in the coal fields, the violence of the Hatfields and the McCoys, a feud that was simmering just across the border in Kentucky. The Mingo Oak murder, as it came to be called, was forgotten. The body was buried. The sheriff moved on to other cases. The hollow went quiet. But the roots of the Mingo Oak ran deep, and the secret that had been buried at its base would not stay buried. Over the years, new stories began to circulate, stories about other men who had gone missing, other bodies that had been found in strange places, other mysteries that had never been solved. And gradually, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that pointed to a truth so dark, so terrible, that no one wanted to speak it aloud. In the summer of 1881, 6 months after the discovery beneath the Mingo Oak, a man named Hollis Sturgill disappeared from his cabin in the hollow above Sand Creek. Sturgill was a timber cutter, a big man with a reputation for hard work and hard drinking. He was not a man who would be easily overwhelmed, but he disappeared nonetheless, leaving behind his cabin, his tools, and his hunting dog. The dog was found wandering the hills, emaciated and terrified, as if it had seen something that had broken its spirit. Sturgill's body was never found, but stories began to circulate, whispered stories, told in the shadows of the general store and the saloon. A hunter claimed to have found a bloody shirt in the brush near the Mingo Oak, a shirt that might have belonged to Sturgill. Another man, a trapper who worked the hollows beyond the ridge, reported hearing sounds in the night, the sound of sawing, the sound of heavy objects being dragged through the leaves. The stories were never confirmed, but they persisted, taking on a life of their own. In the spring of 1882, a young man named Daniel "Danny" Holbrook vanished while walking home from a dance at the schoolhouse in Logan. He had been seen leaving the dance with a companion, a stranger who had come to town a few days earlier and who had seemed, to the girls at the dance, to be both charming and a little unsettling. The stranger had dark hair, dark eyes, and a way of smiling that did not reach his eyes. Danny Holbrook was never seen again. The stranger left town the next morning, and no one remembered his name or where he had come from. Sheriff Dinges investigated the Holbrook case with a doggedness that surprised even his deputies. He traced the stranger to the railroad camp at Chapmanville, but the man had already moved on, taking work on a construction crew that was headed south into Kentucky. The sheriff followed the trail as far as Pikeville, but there it went cold. The stranger had vanished into the hills, and Danny Holbrook's fate remained a mystery. Or perhaps not a mystery. Perhaps there was a connection between the disappearance of Danny Holbrook and the body beneath the Mingo Oak. Perhaps there was a connection between the stranger with the unsettling smile and the killer who knew how to cut a man apart with surgical precision. Henrietta McCoy, the midwife, knew the truth. She had not been able to prove it, but she knew it in her bones. The man beneath the Mingo Oak had been killed by someone who knew how to dismember a body, someone who had done it before, someone who had learned the anatomy of the human form in the most brutal school imaginable. That school, Henrietta believed, was the battlefield. The man who had killed the victim beneath the Mingo Oak had been a surgeon during the war, not a doctor in the conventional sense, but a battlefield surgeon, the kind of man who had been forced to amputate limbs with a saw and a knife, with no anesthesia and no time for hesitation. The kind of man who had seen so much death, so much suffering, that he had become numb to it, immune to the horror of cutting a living body apart. Henrietta had seen such men before. She had nursed them in the hospital tents, seen the faraway look in their eyes, the emptiness that came from doing impossible work in impossible conditions. The war had left them hollow, and some of them had never found their way back. They had drifted west after the war, seeking a new life in the mountains, but the old habits had followed them. The urge to dissect, to observe, to understand the architecture of the human body had become an obsession, a compulsion that they could not control. The man who had killed the victim beneath the Mingo Oak was one of those hollow men. He had killed before, Henrietta was certain of it. He had killed on the battlefield, and he had killed in the years after. The body beneath the Mingo Oak was not his first victim, and it would not be his last. In the autumn of 1884, a traveler arrived in Logan County. He was a tall, thin man with a gray beard and a limp, and he called himself Dr. Jeremiah Barlow. He presented himself as a doctor, a man of learning and refinement, and he claimed to be traveling through the mountains in search of rare botanical specimens. He had a letter of introduction from a professor at the University of Virginia, and he spoke with an educated accent that impressed the better citizens of Logan County. Dr. Barlow rented a room in a boarding house in the town of Logan, and he spent his days walking the hills, collecting plants, and making notes in a leather-bound journal. He seemed to be a respectable man, an intellectual, a gentleman of the old school. But there was something about him that made Henrietta McCoy uneasy. Something in the way he moved, the way he looked at things, the way his eyes lingered on the edges of buildings and the shadows of hollows. Henrietta crossed paths with Dr. Barlow at the general store, and the two of them fell into conversation. He was polite, deferential, and inquiring, asking her about the local plants, the local people, the local history. She answered his questions carefully, giving him nothing more than necessary. But she watched him, studied him, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. The doctor had a collection of tools in his bag, surgical tools, the kind of instruments that a battlefield surgeon might carry. Henrietta recognized them because she had seen such tools before, in the hospital tents of the Union Army. The saws, the scalpels, the knives, all of them carefully maintained, perfectly sharpened. And she noticed, too, that the doctor's hands were steady, his fingers dexterous, the hands of a man who had spent hours, days, years, cutting into human flesh. Henrietta told herself that she was being foolish, that the war had made her suspicious of all men, that Dr. Barlow was nothing more than a harmless scholar. But she could not shake the feeling that she had seen him before, not his face, but his hands. The hands of a man who knew how to dismember a body. A month later, Dr. Barlow left Logan County. He told his landlady that he had completed his research and that he would be moving on to a new location, perhaps in Kentucky or Tennessee. He paid his bill, packed his bags, and disappeared into the hills. No one saw him again, and no one thought much of his departure. But Henrietta McCoy remembered him. She remembered him for the rest of her life, remembering the tools in his bag, the look in his eyes, the steady hands of a man who knew how to take a body apart. A year later, in the autumn of 1885, a man's remains were found in a hollow near the Big Sandy River, in the next county over. The remains had been dismembered, cut apart with surgical precision, the same clean cuts at the joints, the same careful removal of the head and the arms. The body was never identified. The case was never solved. In 1887, a similar body was found in the hills of eastern Kentucky, not far from the town of Pikeville. Again, the dismemberment was the work of a skilled hand, a man who knew exactly where to cut. Again, the body was never identified. Again, the case went cold. And in 1889, a young woman named Eliza Morgan disappeared from her home in Boone County. She was a seamstress, a quiet woman with no enemies and no secrets. Her disappearance was a local sensation, but no trace of her was ever found. Some said she had run off with a lover. Others said she had been killed by an unknown assailant. But Henrietta McCoy knew the truth. Eliza Morgan had been taken by the Hollow Man, the same man who had killed the victim beneath the Mingo Oak, the same man who had left his calling card in the form of dismembered bodies scattered across the mountains. The Hollow Man was still out there, moving from place to place, hunting. And no one could stop him. The Mingo Oak itself lived on, a silent witness to the depredations of the Hollow Man. The old tree continued to grow, its branches spreading over the hollow, its roots penetrating deeper into the earth. It saw the arrival of the railroads, the rise of the coal camps, the spread of the mines, the arrival of the company stores and the company houses. It saw the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys reach its bloody climax, and it saw the long, slow decline of the county as the coal was dug out and the timber was cut down. The tree also saw the disappearance of Henrietta McCoy, who vanished from her cabin in the winter of 1891, never to be seen again. Her body was never found, but her cabin was found burned to the ground, and some said that the fire had been set deliberately, to hide something, to cover something up. Henrietta had known too much. She had seen too much. And in the end, the Hollow Man had found her. The mystery of the man beneath the Mingo Oak remained unsolved for more than a century. The case file, if there was ever a file, was lost to time. The sheriff's records from the 1880s were destroyed in a fire at the county courthouse in 1924. The remains were buried in an unmarked grave, and the cemetery itself was later flooded by a mining operation. The Mingo Oak fell in 1938, and its wood was cut up for lumber, its history forgotten. But the stories persisted. The stories of the Hollow Man, the battlefield surgeon who had lost his soul in the war, the drifter who moved through the mountains, leaving dismembered bodies in his wake. The stories of the strange disappearances, the unexplained findings, the mutilated remains that turned up in the hollows and the hills. And there is one more story, a story that might be the key to it all. A story that has been passed down in the Toler family for generations, a story that Enoch Toler told to his grandchildren, who told it to their children, who told it to their children. A story that might be true, or might be legend, or might be something in between. The story goes like this: Enoch Toler, the boy who found the boot beneath the Mingo Oak, grew up to be a man who never forgot what he had seen. He went to school, learned to read, and became a clerk at the Logan County courthouse. In 1920, he went through the files in the sheriff's office, looking for any record of the case that had haunted him since childhood. And there, in a drawer that had been overlooked for decades, he found a letter. The letter was written on a piece of yellowed paper, in a hand that was formal and precise. It was dated December 15, 1880, and it was addressed to the sheriff of Logan County. The signature at the bottom was illegible, smeared by water or time, but the content of the letter was clear. The letter claimed to be from a doctor in Pennsylvania, a man who had served as a battlefield surgeon during the war. The doctor wrote that he had heard about the body found beneath the Mingo Oak, and that he believed he might be able to identify the victim. The victim, the doctor wrote, was a man named Amos Thatcher, a deserter from the Union Army who had been tried and convicted of cowardice and who had escaped before his sentence could be carried out. The doctor claimed to have known Thatcher, to have seen him after the war, and to have recognized the description of the body. The letter was probably a hoax, Enoch Toler said. A cruel joke, a fabrication. But it had one detail that seemed too specific to be a coincidence. The doctor described the boots that the victim had been wearing, a pair of custom-made boots with a distinctive stitching pattern. The boots were French, made by a shoemaker in New Orleans. The doctor claimed to have seen those boots before, in the possession of Amos Thatcher, who had purchased them in 1879, shortly before his disappearance. Enoch Toler was not sure what to think about the letter. He had heard the stories about the Hollow Man, the battlefield surgeon who had turned to killing, and he wondered if the letter might be a clue to the Hollow Man's identity. The doctor in Pennsylvania claimed to have known the victim, which meant that the doctor might also have known the killer. But the doctor's name was illegible, and his location was vague, and the trail had gone cold. Enoch Toler kept the letter for the rest of his life, and when he died in 1951, the letter was found among his possessions. His son, who inherited the letter, gave it to a local historian, who filed it away with other papers and forgot about it. And so the mystery continued, unresolved, unsolved, a ghost story that refused to die. There is one final detail, a detail that may be the key to the entire story. A detail that has been overlooked, or perhaps deliberately buried, for more than a century. In 1878, 2 years before the discovery beneath the Mingo Oak, a man named Dr. Lewis P. Barlow was arrested in Richmond, Virginia, on charges of murder. Dr. Barlow was a medical doctor, a graduate of the University of Virginia, a former battlefield surgeon who had served with the Confederate Army. He was accused of killing a man named Thomas Pendleton, a patient who had been under his care at a sanatorium in the city. Pendleton's body had been found dismembered, the limbs separated at the joints, the cuts clean, precise, and professional. Dr. Barlow was tried for the murder, but he was acquitted on a technicality, and he left Richmond a free man. In 1880, Dr. Barlow was reported to be living in West Virginia, somewhere in the mountains, but the details were vague. A year later, he was seen in Kentucky, in the town of Pikeville, but the sighting was never confirmed. After 1882, Dr. Lewis P. Barlow seemed to vanish from the record, disappearing into the vast, untracked wilderness of the Appalachian frontier. Some have wondered, in the years since, whether Dr. Lewis P. Barlow and Dr. Jeremiah Barlow, the traveler who visited Logan County in 1884, were the same man. The ages match, the professions match, and the surgical skills match. The name Barlow, after all, is not so common that two men with the same surname and the same profession would be making their separate ways through the same mountains at the same time. And some have wondered, in the years since, whether the Hollow Man was real, or whether he was simply a legend, a story that grew in the telling, a bogeyman created to explain the inexplicable. The Appalachian Mountains are full of such stories, tales of strange men, strange disappearances, strange killings. The mountains are old, and they keep their secrets well. They have been doing so for centuries, and they will continue to do so for centuries to come. The final act in this story unfolds almost a century after Enoch Toler's discovery, in a county archive in Charleston, West Virginia. The archive is tucked away on the third floor of a building that was once a hotel. The iron fire escape outside the window is rusted, and when you look out through the glass, you can see the Kanawha River flowing below, past the barges and the factories, into the coal country beyond. Inside, there are boxes of county records that have never been digitized, never been cataloged, never been read by anyone outside the small circle of local historians who obsess over the details of the past. It is here, in one of those boxes, that the final piece of the puzzle waits. The box is labeled Logan County, Court Records 1875 to 1890. The cover is water-stained, the edges soft with mold. Someone, at some point in the distant past, has written the word Barlow in pencil on the side of the box, a tiny annotation that could mean anything or nothing at all. Inside the box, among the records of land transfers and debt lawsuits, is a single piece of paper. It is an arrest warrant, issued on November 15, 1884, by the Logan County Circuit Court, in the name of Sheriff Harrison Dingas. The warrant orders the arrest of one Dr. Jeremiah Barlow, for questioning in connection with the disappearance of a young woman named Eliza Morgan, who had been reported missing a week earlier. The warrant was never served. On November 16, 1884, Dr. Barlow left Logan County, never to return. The warrant was filed away and forgotten, buried in a box in a county archive, waiting to be discovered by a researcher who might not even know what he was looking for. The paper is fragile, yellowed, the ink faded to a pale brown. But the words are still legible, the signature of the circuit judge still clear. And beneath the signature, in a different hand, there is a single sentence, written in pencil, that seems to have been added later: suspect may have fled toward Kentucky. Known to carry surgical tools. It is a final, haunting detail, a fragment of a story that will never be fully told. It tells us that someone, perhaps the sheriff, perhaps a clerk, perhaps the judge himself, suspected Dr. Jeremiah Barlow of more than just the disappearance of Eliza Morgan. It tells us that someone had connected the dots, had seen the pattern, had realized that the man who was using the mountains as his hunting grounds needed to be stopped. But it was too late. Dr. Barlow was already gone, vanished into the vast, dark wilderness of the Appalachian frontier, leaving behind a trail of bodies and a mystery that would outlive him. What happened to the Hollow Man? That is a question that will never be answered. Dr. Lewis P. Barlow, aka Dr. Jeremiah Barlow, disappears from the historical record after 1884. He might have been killed, died of disease, or simply vanished into the anonymity of the frontier. He might have gone on killing, leaving a trail of dismembered bodies that were never found, never identified, never connected to the man who called himself a doctor. The bodies, if they exist, are still out there, somewhere in the mountains. In the hollows where the coal mines have been abandoned and the timber has been cut down. In the ravines where the streams run black with acid from the mining operations. Beneath the roots of trees that have long since fallen, or beneath the foundations of houses that have long since been abandoned. The mountains keep their secrets. They have been doing so for centuries, and they will continue to do so for centuries to come. The Mingo Oak is gone, but the earth that holds its roots is still there, and beneath that earth, there may be other bones, other secrets, other mysteries waiting to be uncovered. And so the story of the man beneath the Mingo Oak remains a story of loss, of emptiness, of a violence that is embedded in the very bones of the mountains. It is a story that will never have a satisfying resolution, a story that will always be unfinished, a story that will always haunt the hollows and the hills. The question that lingers, long after the final page is turned, is this: if the killers of the frontier were not the outlaws, but the men who were supposed to heal the wounds of the world, then how many other hollow men walk among us, their hands steady, their secrets hidden, their crimes buried in the quiet soil of forgotten places? The mountains know, but they are silent. The trees know, but they have fallen. And all we have, in the end, are the fragments of a story that will never be told in full.